The flight that changed everything. The airport was alive with movement, a controlled chaos of voices, rolling suitcases, and distant announcements echoing through the massive terminal. Business travelers walked with purpose, families juggled children and luggage, and exhausted tourists clung to their boarding passes like lifelines. Among them, an elderly woman stood with quiet grace, unhurried and composed, her presence contrasting sharply with the rush around her. Eloise Gardner had seen the world change around her in ways most couldn't comprehend. At 74, she moved with the kind of dignity that came from a life well lived. Her silver hair was styled neatly, her soft blue shawl draped elegantly over a fitted dress. In one hand, she held a leather purse, the other a small carry-on bag. She didn't need anything more. As she approached the first-class boarding gate, a young agent scanned her ticket with a polite smile. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Gardner. Have a wonderful flight." She nodded with the same quiet appreciation she had always carried, then stepped forward, her heels clicking lightly against the jet bridge floor. Inside the plane, first-class passengers were already settled, some adjusting their seats, others scrolling through their phones. The cabin was a picture of quiet luxury. Plush seats, soft lighting, the faintest scent of fresh leather and perfume. Eloise moved to seat 1B, carefully tucking her bag beside her feet. She had just begun to settle in when a sharp voice interrupted. "Excuse me, ma'am." She turned to find a tall flight attendant looming over her. Danielle Calloway wore her uniform like armor, her posture rigid, her expression cool and authoritative. Eloise offered a polite nod. "Yes." Danielle's gaze flickered to the boarding pass still in Eloise's hand. She reached for it without waiting for permission. "This is first class," she said, her tone carrying a note of something unspoken. Eloise held her gaze. "I'm aware." Danielle hesitated. Something about the elderly woman's calm unsettled her. She glanced down at the ticket, confirming the name and seat number. It was correct. And yet something in her gut twisted. She handed the ticket back with a forced smile. "Just making sure." Eloise took it without another word, adjusting her shawl and turning her gaze toward the window. She had seen this before. She had lived through it more times than she cared to count. Danielle lingered for a second longer before stepping away. Something about the exchange left her unsettled, but she shook it off. She was in charge here. Minutes passed, and the last passengers boarded. The final overhead bins clicked shut. Eloise reached for her purse to pull out a book, hoping for a peaceful flight. But just as she did, Danielle returned. "Ma'am," she said, voice clipped. "I need you to move." Eloise turned again, her patience thinning. "Move." Danielle folded her arms. "There seems to be a mistake. This seat isn't available for you." A heavy silence stretched between them. "My ticket says otherwise," Eloise responded, her voice measured. Danielle exhaled sharply. "I know, but—" She glanced around, as if searching for the right words. "This seat is reserved for a certain type of passenger." A ripple of discomfort passed through the nearby seats. Passengers who had previously ignored the interaction now pretended not to listen, their gazes flickering toward the confrontation. Eloise straightened. And what type of passenger would that be? Danielle's jaw tightened. She hadn't expected pushback. Normally, people like Eloise would quietly comply, avoiding confrontation. Before she could answer, another voice cut through. "Is there a problem here?" A younger flight attendant approached. Emily Reed had been watching from the galley, her expression unsure but concerned. Danielle stiffened. "No problem," she said quickly. "I was just asking Mrs. Gardner to move." Emily frowned. "Move where?" "This is her assigned seat." Danielle hesitated. The economy section was full. She had expected Eloise to walk away, to avoid the discomfort of being challenged. But now, with another crew member watching, she had trapped herself. Eloise met her gaze, calm but unyielding. "I'm not moving." Passengers shifted, a few eyes darting between them, waiting. Danielle clenched her fists at her sides. She had never been challenged like this. Not by a passenger like Eloise, and certainly not in front of an audience. The frustration boiled over before she could stop herself. She reached out and slapped her. The sound cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through first class. Some passengers stiffened in shock. Others turned, eyes wide. Danielle's own hand trembled as she realized what she had done. Eloise had turned slightly from the force of the slap, but when she looked back, her expression wasn't one of shock. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Emily took an unsteady step forward. "Did you just?" Danielle's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. She hadn't meant to do that. Or maybe she had. Eloise didn't react, didn't rub her cheek, didn't cry out. Instead, she reached for her phone, typed a single message, and then folded her hands in her lap. Danielle had no idea that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. A few passengers subtly reached for their own phones. Some were texting, others filming. The cabin, once a sanctuary of quiet luxury, had become a courtroom, each witness holding judgment. Eloise remained seated, unmoving, and as the plane prepared for takeoff, the only thing louder than the roaring engines was the realization settling into Danielle's chest. She had just put her hands on the wife of the man who owned the airline, and now she was no longer just facing an angry passenger. She was about to lose everything. The reckoning begins. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, an almost suffocating stillness that followed the shocking moment like an unshakable ghost. Danielle Calloway stood frozen, her hands still tingling from the impact of the slap she never should have delivered. Around her, the passengers remained in a collective hush, some looking away as if pretending it hadn't happened, others too stunned to react. Phones were out now, not just for texting but recording. It was too late to undo it. Too late to pretend it hadn't happened. And yet, Eloise Gardner sat as still as a statue. She didn't cry. She didn't demand an apology. She didn't call for security. She simply picked up her phone, typed a message, and waited. Danielle's breathing grew shallow. Why wasn't she reacting? Why wasn't she angry? That made it worse. That made it unbearable. "Mrs. Gardner." Emily's voice was hesitant, shaking. The younger flight attendant crouched beside Eloise's seat, her expression etched with disbelief. "Are you okay? Do you need medical assistance?" Eloise slowly lifted her gaze, her deep brown eyes locking onto Danielle's with a look so sharp it cut through the air like a knife. "I'm fine," she said in a voice so calm it sent a shiver down Danielle's spine. Emily swallowed and nodded, but the way her eyes flickered between the two women, she knew this wasn't over. Danielle opened her mouth, about to speak, about to somehow, someway, fix this. Then the overhead intercom crackled. "Captain to lead flight attendant. Report to the cockpit immediately." Danielle's blood turned to ice. Passengers who had been whispering just moments before fell silent. The request wasn't normal. Flight attendants were summoned for security concerns, emergencies, or major flight disruptions. But this was different. Everyone knew it. Danielle's fingers twitched at her sides. For a fleeting moment, she considered ignoring it, pretending she hadn't heard. But there was no escaping this. She straightened her back, forcing herself into the rigid composure she had always used to command respect. "This isn't over," she murmured under her breath toward Eloise, then turned on her heel and strode toward the cockpit. She had no idea just how true those words were. The cockpit was dimly lit, the glow of control panels casting sharp shadows across the space. Captain Jonathan Pierce sat in the pilot's chair, his gaze unreadable, his hand steady on the flight controls. His co-pilot, a younger man with tense shoulders, glanced toward her but quickly looked away. Danielle stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. She folded her hands in front of her, gripping them tightly to keep them from shaking. "Captain," she greeted, keeping her voice neutral. Captain Pierce didn't look at her. Instead, he adjusted a knob on the control panel, his voice unnervingly calm. "Miss Calloway, tell me what happened in first class." Danielle stiffened. "There was an issue with a passenger. I was handling it." "Handling it," he echoed, nodding slightly. Then he turned to her, his blue eyes like steel. "Did that handling include putting your hands on an elderly woman?" Danielle felt her stomach twist. "Captain, I—" The intercom crackled again. "Captain, we have an urgent incoming message from Mr. Charles Gardner. He's requesting direct communication." Every muscle in Danielle's body locked up. She felt her breath leave her lungs as if she had been punched. Charles Gardner. The name alone carried weight. This was no ordinary passenger complaint. This was the kind of situation that ruined careers. That ended them. Captain Pierce didn't even hesitate. He pressed a button on the intercom. "Patch him through." There was a brief silence, then a voice filled the cockpit. A voice that was controlled, calm, and chilling in its authority. "This is Charles Gardner." Danielle's hands clenched into fists. She had heard his voice before, in recorded interviews and corporate meetings, but never like this. Never when it was aimed at her. Captain Pierce straightened. "Mr. Gardner, this is Captain Pierce. We are mid-flight, but I assure you, we err." "I don't need assurances, Captain," Charles interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of someone who expected obedience. "I need confirmation. Did one of your flight attendants just lay hands on my wife?" The air in the cockpit went still. Danielle's throat went dry. Captain Pierce exhaled slowly, his voice measured. "Yes, sir. We are currently." "Good," Charles said smoothly. "Then I trust you'll follow proper protocol." Danielle's pulse pounded so hard she could barely think. Proper protocol. She knew what that meant. It meant an immediate removal from duty. It meant an incident report that would be reviewed by senior management. It meant disciplinary action. But this wasn't a normal situation. This wasn't just any passenger. This was the owner of the airline. "Miss Calloway," Charles continued, his voice cold. "As of this moment, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of the flight." Danielle's world tilted. Captain Pierce didn't argue. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You'll take a crew jump seat in the back of the plane. You will not engage with passengers for the rest of this flight." Danielle opened her mouth to protest, to say something, anything that might change her fate. But Charles spoke again. "And when the plane lands," he said, his voice like a blade, "you will be escorted off and brought directly to an administrative hearing." Danielle's breath caught. "Sir, if I could just—" "You've already done enough," Charles cut in sharply. "You put your hands on my wife. There is no justifying that." Danielle felt her legs tremble. "Enjoy your last flight, Miss Calloway," Charles said. And then the intercom cut off. The silence that followed was deafening. Danielle stood motionless, her heart hammering in her chest. Captain Pierce sighed, rubbing his temple. "Miss Calloway, you have two choices. You can walk to the back of the plane now and take a seat like an adult, or I can call the air marshal on board to escort you." Danielle barely heard him. Her career, it was gone. It was slipping through her fingers faster than she could stop it. She had thought she was untouchable. That the uniform, the years of experience, the authority she carried would protect her. But she was wrong. She had made a mistake, and she was about to pay the price. The walk of shame. Danielle Calloway had always been in control. She was the one who set the rules. She was the one who dictated how things worked in her cabin. She was the one who made decisions, and passengers either followed them or suffered the consequences. But not this time. This time, she was the one being ordered around. Her body felt stiff as she left the cockpit, her heart hammering in her chest. The shame weighed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, crushing her under its weight. As she stepped out, the air inside the first-class cabin was suffocating. Every eye in the room turned to her. Some passengers quickly looked away, others openly stared. A few whispered to their seatmates, and Danielle had no doubt about what they were saying. They had all heard. They knew. Her authority was gone. Her power had been stripped away with a single sentence from Charles Gardner. Danielle took a shaky breath and forced herself to move. She walked past the rows of luxurious first-class seats, past the passengers who had once obeyed her instructions without question, past Eloise Gardner, who still sat with quiet dignity, hands folded in her lap, looking entirely unbothered by the chaos she had just set in motion. As Danielle passed her, Eloise didn't even spare her a glance. That was worse than anything. Worse than anger. Worse than an accusation. Danielle clenched her jaw and kept moving. She reached the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. She had walked through this curtain 1,000 times before, moving between classes with the confidence of someone who ruled over both. But now, it felt different. She wasn't passing through as a figure of authority. She was retreating. Her legs felt weak as she stepped into the economy section. Unlike first class, economy was alive with noise, families speaking, the rustling of blankets, the hum of conversation. But as she moved through the aisle, the energy shifted. People noticed her. Passengers glanced up from their books and screens. Conversations paused. The hush spread like wildfire as more and more people realized something was happening. Whispers started. That's her. She's the one who hit the woman in first class. I heard she's getting fired. Danielle's face burned. Her hands curled into fists as she forced herself to keep walking. She reached the back of the plane, where the crew jump seats were located near the galley. Emily stood there, arms crossed, watching her approach. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Danielle sat down stiffly, fastening her seatbelt as if this were just another routine procedure. She stared ahead, her hands resting on her lap, her fingers curled so tightly her nails dug into her skin. Emily let out a slow breath. I warned you. Danielle snapped her gaze to her. Don't. Emily shook her head, leaning against the galley counter. I told you this was bad. And you still thought you could control it. Danielle exhaled through her nose, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. What do you want me to say, Emily? That I messed up. That I shouldn't have done it. Emily's expression hardened. That would be a start. Danielle turned away. She couldn't do this right now. She couldn't sit here and let Emily, of all people, lecture her. But deep down, she knew Emily was right. She had spent her entire career looking down on others, believing that her position made her untouchable. And yet, with one simple message, Eloise Gardner had unraveled everything. Danielle had never felt so small. The descent into the airport was the longest of her life. The plane's engines hummed, the occasional announcement crackled over the speakers, and yet all Danielle could hear was the deafening silence inside her own mind. She knew what was waiting for her. She knew Charles Gardner wasn't done with her yet. And as the plane touched down with a soft jolt, as the wheels screeched against the runway, her heart pounded harder. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, the cabin came to life. Passengers stood, stretching, gathering their belongings, eager to be off the flight. But no one was in a rush to leave first class, because everyone was watching what was about to happen next. Danielle felt sick. She forced herself to her feet, her body feeling stiff and mechanical. She turned toward the front of the plane, her stomach twisting into knots. And then she saw him. Charles Gardner. He stood just beyond the open doorway of the plane, inside the jet bridge, flanked by 2 airline executives and 2 uniformed security officers. His presence alone sent a wave of dread crashing over her. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice to command respect. He was the type of man who could ruin careers with a single decision. And he already had. Danielle swallowed hard. Passengers who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring. The whispers had started again. This is it. She's done. She's about to get dragged out of here. Danielle clenched her jaw, straightened her back, and forced herself to step forward. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She walked down the aisle, past first class, past Eloise Gardner, who still hadn't moved, still hadn't acknowledged her. Danielle reached the front of the plane, stepping into the jet bridge. And then she stopped. Charles Gardner didn't speak right away. He studied her, his gaze unreadable, his silence stretching unbearably long. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled. "Miss Calloway." Danielle met his gaze, forcing herself not to waver. "Mr. Gardner." He exhaled slowly, tilting his head slightly. "Do you understand why you're here?" Danielle swallowed, her throat dry. Charles lifted a hand. "No excuses." Her jaw tightened. "You had authority," Charles continued. "You had power, and you abused it." Danielle's stomach twisted painfully. "This wasn't just a mistake," Charles said. "It was a choice. You looked at my wife and decided she didn't belong in first class." Danielle's breath caught. Charles took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I don't tolerate that." She felt a lump rise in her throat. "Effective immediately, you are permanently dismissed from this airline." The words hit her like a slap to the face. She had known it was coming. She had prepared herself for it. But hearing it aloud, hearing it in front of an audience, made it real in a way she wasn't ready for. Her legs felt weak. Her breathing was uneven. Charles turned to the security officers. "Escort her out." Danielle's entire body went cold. Passengers inside the plane whispered. Some openly stared. She was being escorted out like a criminal. She had spent her entire career looking down on passengers who caused trouble, who disobeyed rules, who were removed from flights. And now, she was the one being removed. Her throat burned, but she forced herself to keep walking. She stepped forward, out of the plane, out of the job she had dedicated her life to, out of the career she had built from the ground up. And as she walked past Charles Gardner, she heard his final words. "Don't ever step on one of my planes again." Danielle clenched her jaw. She had lost everything, and she knew, deep in her gut, she would never get it back. The fall from grace. Danielle Calloway had spent years climbing the ranks of the airline industry. She had prided herself on her authority, on the way she carried herself in uniform, on the respect that came with her title. Now she was just another disgraced ex-employee walking through the terminal, her head bowed against the weight of humiliation. The two uniformed security officers flanked her on either side as they escorted her through the airport, their presence an unspoken warning. "You're no longer one of us." Passengers moved around them, busy with their own travels, but some stopped. Some turned their heads, whispered, lifted their phones. They knew. Danielle didn't need to hear their words to know what they were saying. She could feel it in the way their gazes lingered, in the way their whispers spread like wildfire. Her downfall had already begun. She had seen it happen to others before. Crew members who made mistakes, who got caught up in scandals, who found themselves at the mercy of the airline's disciplinary system. She had never imagined she would be one of them. The walk to the administrative office felt endless. The sleek floors, the glass-walled conference rooms, the airline banners hanging from the ceiling, places she had once walked with pride, now felt foreign and cold. She was being led through the terminal like a criminal. It wasn't just the humiliation of being fired. It was the realization that she had lost everything. Not just her job, her entire career. And worst of all, her reputation. The airline world was small, tightly connected. News traveled fast, and Charles Gardner had made sure her name would be blacklisted before she even stepped off the plane. As she passed by a group of flight attendants preparing for their next departure, one of them, a junior crew member she had trained, locked eyes with her. Danielle saw the pity in the woman's gaze, and something inside her snapped. She turned away, swallowing the lump in her throat, forcing herself to keep walking. She wasn't going to break. Not yet. The last meeting. The security officers guided her into a private conference room, Inside the airline's administrative office, a long table stretched down the center of the room, and at the far end, seated with a tablet in hand, was Rebecca Lynn, the airline's senior flight operations manager. Rebecca had a reputation. She wasn't cruel, but she was efficient. She handled disciplinary cases with the cold precision of someone who saw people as nothing more than names on a file. Danielle had worked with her before, had even reported other employees to her in the past. Now she was the one being processed out. Rebecca didn't look up at first. She simply tapped her tablet, reviewing whatever file had been placed in front of her. Then, without even greeting Danielle, she said, "You're done here." Danielle's stomach clenched. "I understand I'm being removed from this flight, but Rebecca finally lifted her gaze, her expression unreadable. "You don't understand, Miss Calloway. You're not just being removed from this flight. You're being removed from this airline." Danielle felt her pulse spike. Rebecca turned her tablet toward her. On the screen was a formal termination notice, already signed and dated. "This is final," Rebecca continued. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. Your access to all airline systems has been revoked. Your crew badge is invalid, and your employee file has been flagged." Danielle's mouth went dry. A flag. That was worse than being fired. That meant her name was blacklisted across the industry. Danielle's voice cracked slightly. "This can't be permanent. I've given this airline years of my life." Rebecca didn't blink. "And in 10 seconds, you threw it all away." Danielle's throat burned. Rebecca exhaled sharply, setting the tablet down. "Listen, if this had been anyone else, maybe you'd get a suspension, maybe a disciplinary hearing. But you didn't just insult a passenger, Miss Calloway. You didn't just mishandle a situation." She leaned forward, her voice lowering. "You physically assaulted the wife of the man who owns the airline." Danielle squeezed her hands into fists. "It wasn't intentional." "It doesn't matter," Rebecca cut her off. "It happened. And now, the most powerful man in this industry has decided you don't belong in it anymore." Danielle's breath came in shallow bursts. There had to be a way to fix this. "I'll apologize," she blurted out. "I'll do whatever it takes." Rebecca tilted her head slightly. "Tell me something." Danielle swallowed. "What?" Rebecca's gaze turned sharp. "Are you sorry for what you did, or are you just sorry you got caught?" The words hit like a slap. Danielle opened her mouth, then closed it, because she didn't know the answer. Rebecca sighed, shaking her head. "That's what I thought." She slid a final form across the table. Danielle stared at it. Voluntary surrender of airline identification and uniform. She felt something break inside her. Rebecca folded her hands on the table. "Turn in your badge. Now." Danielle sat frozen. This was it. Her entire career, the years of training, the flights, the promotions, the authority she had clung to. It was all over. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her badge, the small plastic rectangle that had once been her identity. She unpinned it, and then with a final exhale, she placed it on the table. Rebecca picked it up, slid it into an envelope, and without so much as a thank you, she tapped her tablet again. "You will be escorted to the airport exit. You are not to return to any airline property. You are not to contact any active crew members. If you attempt to apply to another airline within our network, your flagged record will automatically deny your application." Danielle sat there, staring at the table, feeling like her entire existence had been erased. Rebecca didn't offer any final words. No sympathy, no advice. She simply looked at the security officer standing behind Danielle. "She's finished here." The officer nodded. "Let's go." The final walk. Danielle barely felt her feet move as she was guided out of the office. The moment she stepped into the terminal, the weight of what had just happened crashed down on her. She had spent years walking these halls with confidence, authority, power. Now, she was just another passenger. And not even that. She couldn't even board one of these planes anymore. Her name would be whispered in break rooms. Her story would be a cautionary tale for new hires. She had gone from senior flight attendant to unemployable in less than a day. She stepped through the sliding airport doors and into the outside air. For the first time in years, she had nowhere to go. No flight schedule. No assignments. No uniform. No job. She reached for her phone, unlocking it with shaking hands. No messages. Not from her former coworkers. Not from anyone. She had been erased. Completely. Her legs felt weak. Her breathing was uneven. She had thought she was untouchable, that her authority made her invincible. But power had never really belonged to her. And now, she had nothing. Nowhere to go. Danielle Calloway stood outside the airport, the cool evening air pressing against her skin. The automatic doors behind her slid shut, severing her final connection to the career she had built over the last 15 years. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she had nowhere to go. She clutched her purse tightly, her fingers trembling around the strap. She could still hear the hum of the airport behind her, the voices of travelers, the rhythmic announcements, the occasional sound of a plane roaring overhead. But she wasn't part of that world anymore. She had been erased from it. A part of her wanted to scream, to storm back into that office and demand that someone listen to her, that someone give her a second chance. But she had seen Rebecca Lynn's face. There was no second chance. Her hands were cold as she pulled out her phone. She opened her contacts, scrolling down a list of names that had once been her professional network. Supervisors, pilots, crew members she had mentored, people who had once respected her, people she had once held power over. She pressed a name, a former supervisor from another airline, someone she had worked with closely before transferring. The phone rang twice, then voicemail. She tried another. Same result. A third. The call connected, but the moment she spoke, the line went dead. Danielle's stomach twisted violently. The blacklist was already in effect. Charles Gardner hadn't just fired her. He had made sure she would never work in the airline industry again. Her breath came fast, shallow. She looked up at the terminal, her eyes darting between the people inside. She had once stood where those flight attendants stood. She had walked these halls with authority, giving orders, making sure passengers followed the rules. Now she was no different from any other person standing on the curb, waiting for a taxi. Actually, she was worse, because no one was waiting for her. She had spent years dedicating herself to her career, cutting ties with family, pushing away friendships, choosing power over people. And now, as she stood outside the airport with nothing, she realized she had no one left to turn to. Her mind raced. What now? She had money saved, enough to get by for a while. But for how long? She could try applying to another job, another industry. But that wasn't easy. Flight attendants weren't just trained in customer service. They were trained in airline safety, emergency procedures, corporate policies. It wasn't like she could walk into an office tomorrow and start fresh. She had built her life around one career, and now that career was gone. The sinking reality of it all hit her like a tidal wave. Her knees went weak. She felt dizzy. A group of airline employees passed by on the sidewalk, heading toward the employee shuttle. A few glanced her way, recognizing her. One of them, a younger flight attendant she had worked with, paused. For a second, Danielle thought she might say something. But then the woman just shook her head and kept walking, like she wasn't worth acknowledging anymore. Danielle felt sick. She gritted her teeth, blinking hard, forcing herself to stand straighter. She would not fall apart in the middle of an airport. She refused. Instead, she squared her shoulders, forced herself to keep breathing, and hailed a taxi. The yellow car pulled up to the curb, and the driver rolled down the window. Where to? Danielle hesitated. For the first time in years, she didn't have an answer. There was no hotel waiting for her on a layover, no schedule telling her where to be, no uniform dictating her purpose. She had no home to go to. She had spent so much time in the air, traveling between cities, staying in temporary housing, that she had never settled down. She had always told herself she didn't need to, that her career was her home. Now that home was gone. "Just drive," she muttered, sinking into the back seat. The driver gave her a curious glance but didn't ask questions. He pulled away from the curb, merging onto the highway. As the lights of the airport faded in the distance, Danielle Calloway finally understood what it felt like to be lost. And for the first time in her life, she had no idea how to find her way back. The weight of consequences. The taxi hummed softly as it sped down the highway, city lights flashing by in streaks of white and red. Danielle Calloway sat stiffly in the back seat, her fingers curled so tightly around the strap of her purse that her knuckles had turned white. Her heart still pounded from the chaos of the past few hours, but now, sitting in the eerie quiet of a car that wasn't hers, she felt something even worse than humiliation. She felt adrift. No schedule. No uniform. No power. For the first time in years, she wasn't in control of anything. Not her job, not her reputation, and certainly not her future. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked again, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Danielle's throat tightened. Where was she supposed to go? She had no home, no permanent address. She had lived out of suitcases, bouncing between hotels, sleeping in layover lounges. Her life had been built around the job, and without it, she had nothing. "Just take me downtown," she muttered. "Somewhere with hotels." The driver nodded and merged onto an exit ramp. Danielle exhaled, leaning back against the seat, staring at her phone. No messages. Not from former coworkers. Not from supervisors. Not from anyone. It was as if she had never existed. A city that no longer felt familiar. The taxi dropped her off in front of a mid-tier hotel, one of the countless places she had stayed in before during layovers. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, anonymous. She paid the driver, gripping her credit card a little tighter as she swiped it through the machine. She had savings, enough to keep her afloat for a while. But that wouldn't last forever. As the taxi pulled away, she stood in front of the hotel entrance, staring up at the glowing sign. For years, this kind of place had been a temporary stop between flights, a resting place before she moved on to the next destination. Now, it was all she had. She walked inside, her shoes clicking against the polished floor, and approached the front desk. The receptionist greeted her with a polite but indifferent smile. Checking in. Danielle hesitated, gripping her purse strap again. "Yeah, just for a few nights." The receptionist nodded and tapped on the keyboard. "Name." She swallowed hard. Danielle Calloway. For years that name had meant something. It had carried authority, respect, even fear. Now, it was just another name on a termination notice. "Danielle," she muttered. "Danielle Calloway." The receptionist barely acknowledged it, handing her a keycard. "Room 712, down the hall. Elevators to your left." Danielle nodded, taking the key with fingers that still trembled slightly. She walked through the lobby, past tired business travelers and families with rolling suitcases, past people who still had somewhere to be. As she stepped into the elevator, her reflection caught in the mirrored walls. She looked different, or maybe she was just seeing herself clearly for the first time. The woman staring back at her wasn't the powerful senior flight attendant who had commanded first-class cabins. She was just a woman in a wrinkled blouse, carrying a bag full of nothing. Loneliness feels different when you have nowhere to go. The hotel room was sterile, the kind of place that wasn't meant to feel like home. Danielle tossed her bag onto the bed, but she didn't move to unpack it. She just stood there, staring at the blank walls, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioning. She had spent her entire life moving. Airport to airport, flight to flight, never stopping long enough to think about what came next. And now there was no next. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands pressing against her lap, and reached for her phone again. Still nothing. No missed calls. No texts. Not a single coworker reaching out. She tried dialing an old friend, someone she had worked with years ago. The call rang 3 times, then went to voicemail. Danielle swallowed, gripping the phone tightly. She tried another, and another. The results were the same. She wasn't just unemployed. She was erased. She had spent years enforcing the rules, making decisions that affected others, believing she was invincible in her position. And yet it had taken less than a day for everyone to forget she existed. Danielle let out a slow, shaky breath, staring at the floor. She had spent so much time building power, making sure others saw her as someone important. Now she had none. And no one cared. Her phone vibrated suddenly, breaking the silence. Danielle's heart leaped. A message. But when she unlocked the screen, her stomach dropped. It wasn't from a coworker. It wasn't from a friend. It was a news alert. Viral video. Flight attendant fired after altercation with passenger in first class. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. She clicked the link. A grainy cell phone video began to play. It showed her, standing in front of Eloise Gardner. The moment she had slapped her. The sound echoed through the cabin. Passengers gasped. Danielle's own face was frozen in an expression of anger, arrogance, frustration. The video cut to another moment, her being escorted off the plane. The caption below the video was brutal. Former flight attendant Danielle Calloway fired after assaulting airline owner's wife. Danielle's fingers went numb. Her worst fear had just become reality. This wasn't just an internal termination. This was public. People had recorded her. And now the entire world was watching. She scrolled down to the comments section. She shouldn't have. But she did. Good. She deserved it. Power-tripping flight attendants think they can do whatever they want. How stupid do you have to be to slap the wife of a billionaire? She's finished. No airline will ever hire her again. Danielle's breathing became uneven. Her career wasn't just over. Her name was ruined. It would be on the news, on blogs, on social media, everywhere. Even if she tried to find a job outside of the airline industry, all it would take was one search of her name, and no one would ever hire her again. Her phone slipped from her fingers, hitting the carpeted floor. She sat on the bed, staring at the blank wall, feeling utterly, completely lost. What have I done? Her entire life had been about control, about being the one who dictated how things went. But now, she wasn't in control of anything. And the worst part, she had done this to herself. A life in freefall. Danielle Calloway had spent her entire career above the clouds, moving through the world with purpose and authority. Now she was grounded, permanently, and for the first time in her life, she had nowhere to go. She sat in the dimly lit hotel room, her body stiff and motionless on the edge of the bed. The soft hum of the air conditioning did little to drown out the deafening silence that filled the space around her. The news article was still open on her phone screen, the viral video playing on loop, each replay hammering the final nails into the coffin of her career. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it, from herself. The moment she slapped Eloise Gardner, the way passengers gasped, the way she had frozen, too shocked by her own actions to react. And then, the most humiliating part, her being escorted off the plane. The weight of it all pressed against her chest, suffocating. How had it come to this? She had spent years building her reputation, climbing the ranks, making sure everyone around her knew she was in charge. Now she was nothing more than a disgraced ex-flight attendant trending for all the wrong reasons. The internet had no mercy. She scrolled down, her breath hitching as she saw dozens of news sites picking up the story. Former flight attendant fired mid-flight for assaulting airline CEO's wife. The downfall of Danielle Calloway. A cautionary tale of power abuse. Watch. Passenger captures the exact moment an airline employee ends her career. Her name was everywhere. She clicked on the comments section. A mistake. This woman got exactly what she deserved. I've had rude flight attendants before. Glad someone finally got what was coming to them. She thought she was untouchable. Now she's unemployed. Karma. Can you imagine being that dumb? Putting your hands on the wife of the billionaire. Now, Danielle felt like she was drowning. She threw her phone onto the bed, pressing her palms against her temples, trying to stop the pounding in her head. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was a complete erasure of everything she had built. Desperation knows no pride. Panic started to creep in. Danielle shot up from the bed, pacing the small room, her thoughts racing. She needed to fix this. Somehow. She reached for her phone again and scrolled through her contacts. She tried calling anyone, former supervisors, ex-colleagues, even a few distant acquaintances from other airlines. No one answered. She left voicemail after voicemail, her voice growing more frantic each time. Hey, it's Danielle. Look, I know you've probably seen the news, but this is all being blown out of proportion. Can we talk? I just need someone to help me figure this out. You know me. You know this isn't who I am. Please, call me back. Nothing. Every number she tried either went to voicemail or was disconnected. Her breath hitched. They had already cut her off. The moment the news hit, her name had become radioactive. No one wanted to be associated with her. Even people she had trained. Even people she had mentored. Gone. Danielle felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. She had been so sure of her place in the industry. She had thought that seniority and experience made her untouchable. But she had never been the one with real power. Charles Gardner had been. And with one text from his wife, he had wiped her from the industry like she had never existed. The bitter taste of reality. Hours passed. She had stopped checking her phone. She had stopped pacing. Now she just sat at the hotel desk, staring at the blank notepad in front of her. She needed a plan. Something. Anything. Because for the first time in years, she didn't even have a schedule to follow. She had never planned for failure. She had never once considered that she might lose everything in a single day. But she had. And now she had to figure out how to survive. Her savings would last her a few months at best. But then what? She had no backup career, no side skills, nothing. The airline had been her entire life. And now she wasn't even allowed to step on a plane. She felt her jaw tighten. She refused to believe it was over. She refused to believe she was going to spend the rest of her life as the woman who ruined herself in 30 seconds. Danielle grabbed the notepad and started writing. Damage control. Try to reach someone in PR. Get ahead of the news. Contact smaller airlines. Maybe an independent company won't care about the blacklist. Temporary work. Anything to keep her afloat. She gritted her teeth. She was not going to disappear. She had worked too hard to just fade away. But deep down, a terrible thought lingered. What if this really was the end? What if she had burned every bridge? What if there was no coming back from this? She shook her head. No, she wouldn't let that happen. She refused to believe that one mistake, one stupid, reckless mistake, was enough to erase everything. Rock bottom hits harder than expected. A knock at the door startled her. Danielle sat up straight, her heartbeat spiking. Who would be looking for her here? She hesitated, then stood up and approached the door cautiously. When she opened it, her stomach dropped. A hotel staff member stood there, holding a printed letter. Miss Calloway. She swallowed. Yes. The employee handed her the envelope. This was left at the front desk for you. Danielle took it, her hands clammy. Who left it? The staff member shrugged. No name, just instructions to make sure you got it. Her pulse pounded as she shut the door and tore the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She froze as she read the words typed neatly in the center. Miss Calloway. There is no place for you in this industry anymore. Don't make it worse for yourself. No signature. No name. Nothing. Her hands shook as she reread it. A warning. A final notice. She stumbled back, her knees hitting the edge of the bed as she sat down hard. Her entire body felt numb. She had thought the worst was over. She had thought she still had a chance. But this was different. This wasn't just being fired. This was a message, a reminder that she wasn't just unemployed. She was done. And no matter how much she tried to fight it, no matter how many desperate calls she made, no matter what excuse she came up with, no one would ever let her back in. She had spent her entire career in control. Now she had nothing. And for the first time in her life, Danielle Calloway had no way forward.